What's up YouTube? It's the one and only Legend of Winning, aka Low, and I'm back with another video. Man, it feels like a long time since I said that intro, and I deeply apologize for the lack of videos within the last months. However, in today's video, we pick it right back up with one of the more interesting topics in the NBA community, and that is clutch. See, in my opinion, some of the more intriguing conversations that we have in the community are centered around the ideology of being clutch. And the reason for this is because when it comes down to determining how clutch a player is, it's possibly the only intangible that we have in all of sports that has an immediate statistical result. Yet for whatever reason, people still overlook the facts and still feel comfortable and confident in pushing narratives based off of their biases.
LeBron James, as great as he is, as gifted as he is, was not born with a clutch gene.
However, today I would like to shed some light in that conversation and thoroughly determine who has been the clutchest player in the NBA over the past decade. Now, to be a bit transparent, it took me a while to research this video because on both NBA.com and on Basketball Reference, there isn't an individual tab for each player for me to look at their averages over a set amount of years when it comes to clutch performances. But because of this, I had to set my own parameters when it came down to researching for this video. One of those parameters had to do with the type of player that I was going to include in my research, and I decided to only look at volume scores. Now, don't get me wrong, role players can definitely make clutch plays, but as we all know, the type of shots that a player like Iguodala is going to receive down the stretch of a very important game is going to be vastly different from the type of shots that Curry is going to receive down the stretch of that exact same game, which then led me down a vigorous rabbit hole when it came down to filtering out players, and it left me with 13 names. If there's any other players that aren't on this list, more than likely they didn't make it because their volume or sample size wasn't large enough. For example, Kemba Walker, who's only had 2 playoff appearances, and also certain big men such as LaMarcus Aldridge and Anthony Davis. Now, the second parameter that I set, and it's going to be a bit controversial, but I decided to only look at scoring stats. Now, the reason why I did this is because A, when it comes to being clutch and performing under pressure, that's more or less just synonymous to how well you can score in those situations. B, I don't want no one in my comment section claiming that X player gets bailed out in clutch situations since he's passing it to open shooters. But seeing more importantly, I believe it was just going to be more interesting to see the scoring numbers rather than looking at rebounds and assists. And third and finally, how exactly did I define being clutch? The first way I defined it is during the regular season, and I just decided to use the default on NBA.com, which is the last 5 minutes in a game with a point differential of 5 or less. The second way that I decided to define clutch is through postseason play, and instead of looking at just the last 5 minutes of a game, I decided just to look at the entire fourth quarter and overtime. And third and finally, even though I find it very simple-minded and annoying to heavily rely on the last 24 seconds argument, it would be very interesting to see who would you want to have taken the last shot in the game. So what I decided to do is, during the regular season and postseason, who would you have taken either the game-tying or go-ahead bucket within the last 35 seconds of action? So first, let's talk about the regular season performances. Just as a quick reminder, we're looking at the last 5 minutes in a game where the point differential is 5 or less. And under those circumstances, Kyrie Irving actually leads all 13 players in points scored while averaging 3.9 points. Following him are Kevin Durant, LeBron James, and Russell Westbrook. And towards the bottom, you have Klay Thompson, who is rather distant from everyone else, averaging less than 2 points. And then ahead of Klay Thompson, you have Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, Jimmy Butler, and DeMar DeRozan, who are all roughly giving you around 2.4 to 2.6 points. Now, moving on to field goal percentage, we have LeBron James leading the pack, shooting 46.5% from the field, which is a noticeable margin to the runner-up, which is Kyrie Irving, and Chris Paul tied, shooting 43.6% from the field. And then towards the bottom, surprisingly, Paul George actually shoots the worst out of everyone, shooting 39% from the field, which is pretty concerning. Not too far removed from him, you have Damian Lillard, Klay Thompson, and Russell Westbrook. Moving on to three-point percentage, at the top of the list, this shouldn't be a surprise. You have Klay Thompson, Kevin Durant, and Steph Curry. And then when it comes to the worst three-point shooters, this really shouldn't be a surprise at all. By a pretty noticeable margin, you not only have DeMar DeRozan, but you also have Russell Westbrook. So makes a lot of sense. And finally, we have free throw percentage, and to nobody's surprise, Steph Curry leads the pack as he's the only player who shoots above 90% in these late game situations. And then towards the bottom of the list, again, not that much of a surprise. However, it is very concerning and noticeable when you have such a massive margin between the last person and the second to last, who is LeBron James, shooting 75% from the free throw line. And then second to that is DeMar DeRozan at 80%. Now, of course, just reading off numbers may not necessarily put things in the best picture for many of you all. So what I decided to do when it came down to effective field goal percentage and true shooting percentage, I decided to graph all of these players amongst one another. And on these graphs, you can clearly see the three players who really separate themselves from everyone else are Steph Curry, Kyrie Irving, and LeBron James. And I would make the argument that since LeBron is such a poor free throw shooter, I would go ahead and confidently state when it comes to regular season performances, either Steph Curry or Kyrie Irving are your best options. And for my own personal preference, I would lean towards Kyrie, largely because his volume and the field goal percentage is very respectable. However, Steph Curry isn't that far removed. But when it comes to who are the worst performers, it is clearly both DeMar DeRozan and Russell Westbrook. Both of them are bottom 2 in three-point percentage, effective field goal percentage, and true shooting percentage. And they are also in the bottom when it comes to free throw percentage. And if I had to choose between one or the other, I would say that Westbrook is actually the worst performer, largely because of his volume, which is just completely unjustifiable when you look at his efficiency. But when it comes to the amount of shots that he attempts, he actually leads all 13 players, which again is just ridiculous. Now, moving on to playoffs, and just as a quick reminder, we're looking at the entire fourth quarter and overtime. And leading in points, we have LeBron James at 7.5. Following him, you have Kevin Durant, Damian Lillard, and Russell Westbrook. And then at the bottom of the list, we have Klay Thompson at 4.2. Then after that, we have Kawhi Leonard, DeMar DeRozan, and Kyrie Irving. Next up, we have field goal percentage. And in this category, I am highly surprised in various different ways. Looking at the bottom, we have Kyrie Irving, Paul George, and Damian Lillard all shooting 40% or worse. Now, for me, that's really surprising when it comes to Kyrie Irving, especially when you put into context that majority of his postseason runs have featured him alongside LeBron James. So for him to shoot that poorly from the field just doesn't make any sense at all. But the player that is worse is Russell Westbrook, shooting below 37% from the field. And you know what makes it even worse? That he actually leads all of these players in volume, averaging out 5.9 shot attempts in the fourth quarter and in overtime. But then when it comes to the top of the list, we have Kawhi Leonard, Kevin Durant, LeBron James, and James Harden, as all of them are shooting 45% or better from the field. And then leading the pack is Chris Paul, shooting 50% from the field in fourth quarter and overtimes, which to me was extremely impressive. And I was definitely surprised because I was not expecting a point guard to lead that statistical category. Moving on to three-point percentage, not too much of a surprise except for the fact that Kawhi Leonard leads the pack, shooting above 40% from behind the arc, but not too far removed from him. You have Steph Curry, then Jimmy Butler, Chris Paul, and Klay Thompson. And then at the bottom, again, no real surprise here. You have DeMar DeRozan. Following him, you have Russell Westbrook. But what is a surprise is James Harden, who's shooting 30% from behind the arc, which is rather low for somebody who receives the title of being a three-point shooter. Then when it comes to free throw percentage, we have Steph Curry shooting above 90%. Following him, you have Chris Paul, who is putting up very impressive postseason numbers so far. Then Damian Lillard, DeMar DeRozan, and Kyrie Irving. And then at the bottom, again, no surprise, you have LeBron James shooting 76% from the charity stripe. And then right above LeBron, disappointingly enough, is Paul George, as he's the only other player on this list who shoots below 80% from the free throw line in fourth quarter and overtimes during playoff games. And finally, when we look at the effective field goal percentage and true shooting graphs, they are very telling. So the first thing I want to point out is LeBron, who is completely debunking the myth that he's afraid to take any important shots down the stretch of close games. However, the one thing that does stand out to me is his efficiency, as he only shoots 45% from the field, low 30s from behind the arc, and of course, being the worst free throw shooter of these group of players, his efficiency just isn't that impressive at all, which is highly disappointing. And quite honest, if it wasn't for how bad Russell Westbrook performed, the average for effective field goal percentage and true shooting percentage would have been a bit higher, which thus meant that LeBron would have been below average in both of those categories. And to be completely honest with you all, I just was not expecting that at all. The second thing I noticed is James Harden, who is okay in these situations. He's not great, but probably isn't as bad as a lot of people depict him out to be, which definitely doesn't negate some of the poor performances and unforgivable moments that he has displayed throughout his postseason career. However, when you look at the numbers in totality, his numbers really aren't that bad. The player who was a massive surprise was Kawhi Leonard, who was at the top of both effective field goal percentage and true shooting percentage. However, his volume just isn't there. He's really only had 2 postseason runs where he has been the first option when it comes to scoring. So I don't feel confident and comfortable claiming that he has been the clutchest performer during the playoffs. But the player I do feel comfortable in saying that with is Chris Paul, who has not only been roughly average when it comes to points scored, but also leads his pack in field goal percentage, has a very respectable 3-point percentage, and is second when it comes to free throw percentage. And then when it comes to the bottom, however, and as you all can clearly see, my goodness, Russell Westbrook, what is going on? Westbrook has an effective field goal percentage that is below 40%. Be very mindful that he has the highest volume out of everyone when it comes to shot attempts. That is completely unacceptable. I don't care how you slice it. It just does not justify the amount of shots that Westbrook receives when you look at his efficiency in all categories. Following after that, we have both DeMar DeRozan, which isn't that much of a surprise, but Kyrie Irving, which is a bit of a surprise. And it is very disappointing when you put into context that, again, he has played alongside LeBron James. And finally, let's look at the who would you want taking the last shot argument. Again, just as a quick reminder, these are game tying or go ahead buckets in the last 35 seconds in both the regular season and playoffs. And under these circumstances, there's no need for me to go into any deep details about points and free throw percentages. The thing that's way more important is accuracy. So we're only going to look at field goal percentage and also dabble in 3-point percentage as well. But when it comes to the regular season, by a noticeable margin, we have Klay Thompson at the top, shooting 44% from the field. However, his volume is noticeably lower than everyone's else, as he's only attempted 25 of these shots during the regular season and has made 11 of them. However, if you're looking for the right mixture of volume and accuracy, then you have to go with both James Harden and Kyrie Irving, who both are the only other 2 players who shoot above 36% from the field, with James Harden shooting 25 for 65 from the field, and then you have Kyrie Irving shooting 21 for 55 from the field. And then when it comes to 3-point percentage, both of them are second and third behind Klay Thompson as well. And then at the bottom, you have Paul George, who is shooting 11 for 63. 17.5% from the field on game tying or go ahead buckets in the last 35 seconds during regular season games. And then second to that, of course, as always, is Russell Westbrook, who is 35 for 125, which gives him a field goal percentage of 28%. Now moving on to the playoffs, and this is where it's going to get a bit controversial because the volume just isn't there, and that's the reason why I don't like using these arguments. So at the top of the list, we have Chris Paul, Jimmy Butler, Kawhi Leonard, and Kyrie Irving, who are the only players who shoot above 50% on game tying or go ahead buckets in the last 35 seconds of a game. However, the volume, it's not even respectable. The only player who actually has a respectable field goal percentage on a respectable volume is LeBron James, who was 8 for 19, shooting 42% from the field. The rest of the players more or less follow that pattern when it comes to volume, except for Klay Thompson and Paul George, whose volume is relatively low. However, they've only made 1 for 3 or 1 for 4 respectively. However, the 2 players who have high volume and low efficiency is James Harden and Russell Westbrook. Westbrook at this point really shouldn't be that much of a surprise to you, but the amount of shots that they've missed is ridiculous. James Harden, 1 for 15. Russell Westbrook, 2 for 16. Then when it comes to shooting threes, Russell Westbrook, 0 for 10. James Harden, 0 for 7. Just ridiculous. However, when it comes to just taking the last shot during the playoffs, I'm going to lean more so towards LeBron because of the volume and a very respectable field goal percentage as well. So, what did we learn today? 1, I have way too much time on my hands. 2, perception is king, which is something that I was alluding to in the beginning of this video, where you have these narratives that are built around players. However, when you look at the actual facts, it tells a completely different story. For example, when you look at players such as Damian Lillard and Kevin Durant, where most people would make the argument that they are elite performers in the clutch. However, when you look at their numbers, they're average, and in some cases they're actually mediocre. But on the flip side, you have players such as Jimmy Butler and LeBron James who really don't come up that often in these conversations, especially Jimmy Butler, who I was pleasantly surprised at when I looked at his numbers. And then when it comes to LeBron, as we all know, many people over the past decade have tried relentlessly to try to push his narrative that he is not a clutch performer. Another thing that I learned is that Russell Westbrook is by far the worst performer out of all of these names. Now, let me be clear, when it comes to being clutch, I would make the argument that all of these players are clutch performers because being clutch is an intangible, since you have to have the mental fortitude to attempt the shots while being under pressure, which is something that Westbrook clearly has no problem with doing at all. However, when you look at the efficiency from Westbrook under these circumstances, it just doesn't justify the volume. But what makes it even worse, damning, and even more frustrating is when you realize that Westbrook has actually played alongside other players on this list, such as Kevin Durant, James Harden, and Paul George, and yet for whatever reason has a higher volume than all three of those players, but the efficiency just isn't as good as any of those players, which means that there were better options in these late game situations. But finally, who has been the clutchest performer in the decade? And I would have to say it's Chris Paul. Not only does he have the volume and the consistency, but the efficiency is there as well. His accuracy is highly impressive, especially in the playoffs. And you got to take into consideration that for a majority of his career, he has been the only player on his teams who has the ability to attempt, create, and make these type of shots that are necessary in these clutch situations. So I feel very confident in saying that Chris Paul over the past decade has been the clutchest player in the NBA. But with all that being said, people, please let me know what you think about the video in the comment section below. Also, make sure you hit the subscribe button. We are almost at 200,000 subscribers. And until next time, I will see you all later. Peace.